The morning they told Warren Caldwell his daughter might never wake up, he was standing in the parking garage of St. Michael's Hospital in Calgary, still wearing the suit he'd put on for the board meeting that now felt like it had happened in another lifetime. He hadn't cried. That surprised him. He'd expected to fall apart right there on the concrete floor between his car and the elevator. But instead he just stood very still with his phone in his hand and the underground fluorescent light humming above him, and he thought, I can fix this. I fix things. That's what I do. Warren had built Caldwell Resource Group from nothing, from a single leased office in Edmonton, with second-hand chairs and a coffee maker that only worked if you hit it twice on the left side. 23 years later, the company moved over $4 billion in natural gas contracts annually, and his name appeared in the Financial Post, often enough that his assistant had stopped saving the clippings. He had a house in Elbow Park with 11 rooms he'd never once counted. He had people whose entire job was to solve problems before Warren even knew the problems existed. But his daughter Nadia was 28, and she was upstairs in the ICU, and the neurologist, a careful, soft-voiced man named Dr. Osi, who clearly hated delivering bad news, had just explained that the traumatic brain injury from the car accident 3 days ago had caused something called diffuse axonal damage, and that while they couldn't predict outcomes with certainty, the longer she remained unresponsive, the less likely meaningful recovery became. Warren drove home. He sat in his kitchen. He did not eat dinner. Nadia had been driving back from Banff on a Sunday evening. Black ice on the Trans-Canada. The other driver walked away. His daughter did not. She'd been calling him that Sunday. He'd seen it on his phone later, 2 missed calls at 6:47 and 6:52 p.m. He'd been in a dinner with the Athabasca joint venture partners, and he'd let it go to voicemail, thinking he'd call her back after dessert. There had been no voicemail. There had been instead a call from a number he didn't recognize at 8:14 p.m. and a voice telling him to come to the hospital in Calgary. He had not listened to those missed calls. He didn't know what she'd wanted to tell him. That detail lived in his chest like a splinter he couldn't reach. The hospital became his second home. He came every morning before 8 and stayed until visiting hours ended at 9. He sat beside Nadia's bed and talked to her about small things, because the big things felt too heavy to say out loud in that room with its beeping monitors and its pale blue curtains. He told her about the weather. He told her about the construction on 17th Avenue that never seemed to end. He read her articles from the Globe and Mail that he thought she might find interesting, although Nadia had always been better at caring about the world than he was. And sometimes he couldn't finish the articles because he'd get to a line about something she'd argued with him about at Christmas dinner, and he'd have to stop. She'd been a social worker. She worked with kids in foster care in the northeast end of the city. She drove a 2009 Honda with a broken rear defroster, and she donated a percentage of every paycheck to 3 different charities, and she was 30 years younger than most of the causes she believed in. Warren had spent a lot of years wishing she'd applied her considerable intelligence to something that paid more. He understood now, with a comprehensiveness that was almost physically painful, how little that had mattered. Dr. Osi was professional and kind, and he never promised things he couldn't promise. By the 4th week, he sat down with Warren in a small consultation room that smelled of stale coffee, and he said gently that they needed to begin discussing longer-term care options, that there were excellent facilities, that some patients in Nadia's condition had shown small improvements over months or years, but that Warren should prepare himself for the possibility that this was who his daughter was going to be. Warren asked what he meant. Dr. Osi said it carefully, that the brain, once damaged in this way, did not reliably repair itself, that modern medicine could sustain her, that it could not guarantee her back. Warren went to his car, and he sat in the parking garage for a very long time. It was his assistant, Bernadette, who first mentioned the name. Bernadette had been with him for 14 years, and she knew him well enough to know when he needed information and when he needed to be left alone, and she was rarely wrong about which was which. "There's a woman," she said, one morning when she brought him coffee before his first call. "A few people in the city have mentioned her. She's not a doctor." Warren looked up. "She lives in Bowness. She's Métis. Her name is Agnes Swifthawk. She's known for—" Bernadette paused, "for working with people who've been told there's nothing left to try. Families bring people to her, sometimes from quite far away." Warren said carefully. What exactly does she do? I don't fully know, Bernadette admitted. I asked around. The answers weren't very specific. But I spoke with a woman at my church whose husband had a stroke 2 years ago and was non-responsive for 6 weeks. The doctors had told them to begin thinking about palliative options. Bernadette looked at him steadily. He's retired now and he's growing tomatoes in his backyard in Cochrane. Warren was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who believed in things he couldn't verify. He had built his career on numbers, on contracts, on the precise language of what could be proven. Send me whatever you can find, he said. There wasn't much to find. Agnes Swifthawk did not have a website. She was not on social media. She appeared briefly in a 2019 article in a small Calgary community paper about Indigenous healing traditions, where she was quoted saying only that she used what her grandmother had taught her and that she didn't make promises, only attempts. The article mentioned that she lived with her granddaughter, a girl named Petra, and that she accepted no payment. That last part gave Warren pause. In his experience, people who charged nothing were either very desperate or very sure of themselves. He drove to Bowness on a Thursday afternoon in late November, when the temperature had dropped to -14 and the sky was the particular flat gray that Calgary got in the deep part of winter, like a lid pressed down on the city. The address was a small house on a street of small houses, the kind of neighborhood that hadn't changed much since the 1970s, except that it cost more now. There was a birch tree in the front yard that had been strung with lights that were not on in the daytime. A shoveled path to the front door. He knocked. The door was answered by a girl. She was perhaps 10 or 11, slight, with dark eyes and braided hair, and the particular watchful quality of a child who has learned to read rooms quickly. She was wearing a sweater 2 sizes too big for her, and she had paint on her left hand, the faded kind that meant it had been there for a while, and she hadn't bothered to scrub it off. "Hi," she said. She looked at him without the nervousness most children had around strangers. Just looked at him, steady, the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. "I'm looking for Agnes Swifthawk," Warren said. "She's in the back," the girl said. "I'm Petra. Are you the man who called?" He had not called. He hadn't known a number to call. "No, Petra considered this. "Okay," she said, and stepped back to let him in. Agnes Swifthawk was in her kitchen, which was warm in a way that the Calgary winter made feel like a small miracle. She was older than he'd expected, somewhere past 70, with white hair worn loose and hands that moved with the deliberate ease of someone who had been using them for a very long time. She was making something that smelled of cedar and something sweet he didn't recognize. She looked up when Warren came in, and she did not look surprised. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. He sat. Petra appeared in the doorway and then disappeared again. "Tell me about her," Agnes said. He told her. He told her about the accident, about the diffuse axonal damage, about Dr. Osie's careful, soft voice. He told her about the missed calls at 6:47 and 6:52, and he wasn't sure why he told her that part, but once he started, he couldn't stop. Agnes listened the way very few people listened, without filling the silences or nodding too quickly. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a doctor," she said. "You know that." "Yes. I won't promise you anything. I never promise. I understand. And I don't come to people," she said. "People come to me. If your daughter comes here, and if she's willing, and the body has a kind of willingness even when the person can't speak, then I'll try what I know how to try. But you need to stop thinking of this like a contract. There's no clause. There's no guarantee." Warren, who had spent his adult life writing contracts and believing in clauses, said nothing. "When can you bring her?" Agnes asked. The process of arranging a medical transfer to a home care setting was not simple, and Warren's money made it somewhat less impossible than it would otherwise have been. He hired a private nursing team. He rented medical equipment. He had a heated van retrofitted for transport. Dr. Osie was skeptical but not obstructive. He said, carefully, that there was no medical evidence to support traditional healing approaches for diffuse axonal injury, but that he also understood the family's need to feel they were doing something, and he outlined the monitoring protocols they'd need to maintain. His wife, Diane, they'd been divorced for 11 years, and Nadia was her daughter, too, called him when she heard. "Warren, I know what you're going to say. She's not a project," Diane said, and her voice was so tired it barely had edges anymore. "You can't solve her. I'm not trying to solve her. You've hired 14 people, 13, one of them Warren. There was a long pause. I just want her to be okay, however that happens. That's all I want too, he said. Diane was quiet for a moment. Tell me about this woman, she said. Nadia arrived at Agnes's house on a Wednesday in December. The nursing team brought her in on a transport chair, and Agnes stood in the front room and watched without saying anything. Petra stood beside her grandmother, and Warren noticed that the girl had taken Agnes's hand. Not the other way around. She had reached for it, not for comfort, but the way you reach for something you want to steady. Agnes walked over and crouched down in front of Nadia's chair. She looked at Nadia's face for a long time. "Hello, sweetheart," she said quietly. "I'm glad you came." Warren was standing by the door, and something about the way Agnes said it, the complete absence of pity in her voice, just simple greeting, like Nadia had walked in under her own power, made him have to look at the ceiling for a moment. They converted the ground floor bedroom into a proper care space. Agnes came in twice a day. What she did was not dramatic. It was not what Warren had half expected, which he was somewhat ashamed of expecting. There was no ceremony, no ritual objects, nothing he could point to and categorize. Agnes talked to Nadia. She used her hands on pressure points along Nadia's arms, her neck behind her ears, quiet, deliberate, like someone who knows exactly where they're going. She played recordings of drumming softly in the mornings. She brewed things in her kitchen that smelled of the land in late summer, of pine and something he didn't have a name for, and these she applied to Nadia's temples and the soles of her feet. She sang sometimes, under her breath, in a language Warren didn't speak. Petra came too most days after school. She would sit beside Nadia and do her homework on the edge of the bed, perfectly comfortable, as though it was the most natural thing in the world to work through long division 3 feet from someone who couldn't respond. She talked to Nadia the way Agnes did, not at her, to her. She told Nadia about things that happened at school. She described her drawings. She read aloud from whatever book she was working on that week. Warren watched this from the doorway sometimes and felt something he didn't have an immediate word for. After the second week, he found himself in Agnes's kitchen while Agnes made tea, and he asked her about Petra. Where was her mother? What happened to her father? Agnes handed him a cup. "Petra's mother is my granddaughter," she said. "She's had some difficulties. Petra has been with me for 3 years now." She said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe weather. "Petra is fine. She's one of those children who knows who they are." Warren thought about Nadia at 10, who had also known who she was, who had come home from school one day and informed him at dinner that she wanted to be a doctor, and then changed that to social worker at 14, and had never wavered after that. He had spent so long wanting her to want different things that he had almost missed how remarkable it was that she knew her own mind so completely. "She's good with Nadia," he said. "She's good with everyone," Agnes said simply. "She doesn't see sick people as different. She just sees people." It was a Thursday in the 3rd week, in the mid-afternoon when the winter light came flat and low through the bedroom window, that Warren was sitting in the chair by the bed, reading or trying to read, a book he kept losing the thread of when he heard it, a sound, not a monitor, not the house settling, something that came from Nadia. He lowered the book slowly. Her eyes were still closed, but her right hand, which had been flat on the blanket, had moved. Not much. The fingers had curled slightly inward, as though she were trying to hold something. Warren set the book down very carefully on the floor, as though any sudden motion might undo it. He leaned forward. "Nadia," he said quietly. "Nadia, sweetheart, I'm here. Nothing else happened." But the hand stayed curled. He called for the nurse. He called Dr. Osi. He sat in the hallway while they assessed her, and he noticed that his hands were shaking for the first time since this had all started, because up until now he had not let them. Dr. Osi came the next morning, and when he walked out of the room his expression was different, still careful, but different. "There's purposeful movement," he said. "Intentional. That's significant. It's a small indicator, but it's real." He paused. "I can't attribute it to any specific intervention, but I want to note that it's present." Warren nodded. He did not say anything. He went and found Agnes in the kitchen and told her. She listened, and she nodded, and she said, "Good. Just that. The way you say good when something that was supposed to happen has happened." He found Petra in the backyard that evening, despite the cold. She was crouched in the snow next to a bare patch of ground near the fence, poking at something in the dirt with a stick. She looked up when she heard the back door. "She moved her hand today," Warren said. Petra nodded. "I know," Grandma told me. He stood on the step for a moment. "Does it surprise you?" Petra thought about this. "Not really," she said. "I think she's been in there the whole time." "Just." She waved the stick vaguely, searching for the word, having trouble with the door. Warren looked at this girl, crouched in the snow in -12 with paint on her left hand and an oversized sweater and absolute unquestioning certainty that his daughter was going to come back, and he felt something shift in his chest that had been calcified for a very long time. He sat down on the back step, which was cold enough that he felt it through his coat. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "There's a beetle that lives under here in winter," Petra said. "Under the bark of that old root. Does he need checking on?" "Probably not," she admitted. "But I like to make sure." Warren looked at the dead grass and frozen dirt and the pale gray sky above the fence line. He thought about Nadia calling him at 6:47. He thought about all the dinners he'd left early and all the calls he'd returned late and all the times Nadia had said, "It's fine, Dad. I know you're busy," and he had let her say it, had let her give him that out, because it was easier than rearranging things. "I have a lot of time to make up for," he said. He wasn't sure he meant to say it out loud. Petra looked at him. "She didn't say it'll be okay, or I'm sure she knows you love her, or any of the other things people said. She just looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, 'Probably. But you're here now.'" He didn't say anything, but he stayed on the step, in the cold, until Petra was satisfied that her beetle was accounted for. Nadia opened her eyes on a morning in January, 17 days after her hand moved. It was not the sudden cinematic waking that Warren had imagined in his less guarded moments. Her eyes opened partway, unfocused the way a person surfaces from very deep water slowly. The nurse was in the room. Agnes was there. Petra had been sent to school, but Agnes had called her in the car, and Petra's teacher, who had apparently been briefed on the situation by Agnes weeks ago, sent her home early without question. Warren was holding Nadia's hand when her eyes opened. He said her name very quietly, and he watched her face try to arrange itself around recognition. It was like watching something come back from a very long way away. Her lips moved. No sound at first, and then, thin and effortful like something she had to search for, "Dad." He had not cried in the parking garage. He had not cried in the consultation room. He had not cried in Agnes's hallway or on Agnes's back step or in any of the 52 days that had passed since a stranger had called him at 8:14 p.m. He cried now. He held her hand and he cried, and he didn't try to stop, and Nadia, barely there, barely back, barely holding the thread, moved her thumb slightly against his knuckles, which was the closest she could get to telling him it was okay. Recovery was slow and it was hard, and there were days that were frightening in new ways. Language came back in pieces. Motor function required a physiotherapy team who came every morning and pushed Nadia in small, patient increments. There were headaches that made her close her eyes and go somewhere unreachable for hours. There was the day she forgot Warren's name, which was a side effect of swelling that resolved in 48 hours. But those 48 hours were among the hardest Warren had ever lived through. But she came back. Not all at once. Not the same. Dr. Osei was careful to explain that recovery from this kind of injury was not a return to a previous state, but a construction of something new. That Nadia would be Nadia, but that some things would be different, and that different didn't mean worse, it just meant adjusted for. She asked about Agnes 2 weeks into her conscious recovery. Warren told her. Nadia was quiet for a while. "Can I meet her?" she said. Agnes came the following Tuesday. She sat beside Nadia's bed, and they talked for a long time, just the two of them, while Warren waited in the kitchen and made tea badly, and tried to give them whatever room they needed. When Agnes came out, she looked at him with something that might have been satisfaction, the quiet kind. "She's going to be fine," Agnes said. "How can you know that?" Agnes looked at him with what he slowly realized was patience. "Because she asked about the work I do," she said. "She wants to know how it works. People who are going to be fine are always curious." Petra became, in some way that no one had formally arranged, a part of the shape of things. Nadia liked her. It turned out they had things in common. Nadia had done a practicum in Bowness, years before, with an after-school program 2 streets from Agnes's house. Petra had been in that program when she was 7, before she came to live with Agnes. Neither of them had known until Nadia mentioned it one afternoon, the way you discover threads connecting things you thought were separate. "Small world," Petra said, in the way 10-year-olds say small world, without irony and without surprise, as though the world arranging itself like this was simply what the world did. Nadia laughed. It was the first time Warren had heard her laugh since before. It was not quite the same as her old laugh. A little more careful, a little slower to arrive, but it was fully hers, and it moved through the room like something that had been waiting to happen. Warren made arrangements without Agnes knowing. He set up a trust that would cover Petra's education through university, structured through a legal firm so that it came without his name on it, because he understood, from everything Agnes had said and not said, that she would refuse any direct offering. He also made a significant contribution to a society that supported Indigenous cultural education in Calgary schools, which Bernadette arranged with her usual invisible efficiency. Agnes called him a week later. "A trust appeared," she said. "I don't know anything about that," Warren said. There was a long pause. "Warren?" "Yes? Thank you," she said. Her voice was dry and a little tired and completely without sentimentality. "Don't do it again without asking." "Understood," he said. "And come for dinner Thursday. Petra is making her grandmother's recipe for bannock, and she needs someone to practice on who isn't me." He came on Thursday. He came the Thursday after that, and the one after that. Nadia came too, eventually, once she could manage the car ride, and sat at Agnes's kitchen table in the warmth of that small house and ate bannock, and listened to Petra explain the precise habits of her overwintering beetle, with a focus that Nadia said afterward reminded her of the most passionate social work students she'd ever supervised. "She's going to do something extraordinary," Nadia said, on the drive home. Warren thought about a girl in a too-big sweater, crouched in the snow, checking on something small and alive and easy to overlook. "I think so too," he said. The city lights came up as they drove, the long orange-lit arteries of Calgary spreading out in every direction, full of people in houses Warren would never know, living lives he would never see. He'd always moved through the city like it was a backdrop to his own story. He wasn't sure exactly when that had started to change. But it had. Nadia reached over from the passenger seat and turned up the radio. Something low and familiar he half recognized, and leaned her head back against the headrest, and they drove home together through the winter dark.